We will begin, as we always do, with the plain truth of it, because these stories deserve nothing less. She was 47 years old, standing at the edge of a dirt road in Colorado territory with $11 sewn into her coat lining and nowhere on this earth she could call home. Her name was Eleanor Bracken, though the valley would come to call her Nell, and she had been cast out of her own farmhouse by her late husband's brother, a man named Silas Bracken, who had named himself executor of an estate that was never rightfully his to divide. He told the county she owed debts she had never seen a ledger for. He sold her cattle before the frost even left the fields. And when she asked him, quietly, where she was meant to go, he had looked at her the way a man looks at a fence post he intends to pull. What little she had left, $11, a trunk of her mother's linens, and a Bible with her husband's name written inside the cover. She carried on foot into a town called Copper Notch, where the railroad had abandoned an old signal tower on a bluff above the tracks, and where a tired clerk sold it to her, land and all, for $8, because no one else wanted a rusted tower that hadn't worked in a decade. Folks in town would later say she'd been foolish, throwing away good money on a ruin. They did not know yet what slept inside its gearbox, sealed, forgotten, waiting, a secret that would not only restore what had been stolen from her, but would give an entire valley back its name. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eleanor Bracken. If you're watching this from a place that others have written off as empty or worthless, tell us where you're from in the comments, because this story is for you. Eleanor Bracken had been born Eleanor Foss in a river town in Missouri, the daughter of a cooper who believed that everything discarded still had use in it, if a person was patient enough to look. He kept a workshop full of broken barrels, bent nails straightened one at a time on an anvil, and warp stave he steamed back into shape rather than burn. Neighbors called him stubborn. He called himself thrifty, and more than that, respectful of the labor and the tree and the years that had gone into making a thing in the first place, even a thing that looked ruined. Eleanor grew up at his elbow. Learning to read would grain the way other girls learned embroidery, learning that rust was not the same as ruin, that rock could be cut away and the good wood beneath could still hold a house together. It was her father who taught her to read mechanisms too, clock gears, pump handles, the iron guts of things, because he said a woman who understood how something worked could never be fully cheated by a man who assumed she didn't. She married young, to a quiet homesteader named Thomas Bracken, who had come west with his brother Silas to claim land in the Larkspur Valley, a green cleft in the mountains fed by 2 creeks and framed by red bluffs, where the Cordell Rail and Land Company had once run a spur line up to the mining camps before the silver played out and the company pulled its rails and its attention elsewhere. Thomas was a gentle man, more interested in his orchard than an argument, and Eleanor loved him for the same reason her father had loved broken barrels, because he was steady and true and undervalued by louder men. Silas, by contrast, had always wanted more than his portion and had always resented that Thomas, the younger brother, had somehow ended up with the better land, the better wife, the better temperament. Eleanor did not know, in those early years, how much that resentment had been quietly compounding, like interest on a debt she did not know she owed. She spent those years learning the valley the way she'd once learned her father's workshop, learning which families had come first, which had papers and which had only promises, learning the creeks by their moods, learning that the old railroad tower on the bluff above Copper Notch had once housed a signalman named Abel Whitcomb, a man some of the old-timers spoke of fondly and vaguely, as though his memory had been sanded soft by time. She raised 2 gardens worth of vegetables every summer, kept bees, mended what broke instead of buying new, and taught herself patience as a discipline rather than a virtue that came naturally, because in truth Eleanor Bracken was not a patient woman by nature. She was a curious one, and curiosity, she had learned, required patience as its traveling companion. She often told her husband that nothing was ever truly empty, only unexamined, and he used to laugh and say she'd make a fine detective in another life, not knowing how soon that life would come calling. The fall came slowly, and then all at once the way falls often do. Thomas died in the spring, thrown from a wagon on the switchback road above Copper Notch when a wheel splintered on stone, and Eleanor buried him beneath the cottonwood he'd planted the year they married. and for a while grief was the only weather she knew. She did not think, in those raw weeks, to ask who held the papers to the farm, because Thomas had always managed such things, and because she trusted, foolishly perhaps, that family looked after family. Silas Bracken did not wait long. He arrived within a month with a lawyer from the county seat and a set of documents that named him executor of his brother's estate, on the grounds that Thomas had died without a proper will, a claim Eleanor could never disprove, since the only man who could have testified otherwise was in the ground beneath the cottonwood. Silas told her, not unkindly on the surface, that there were debts to settle, a loan against the orchard she had never heard mentioned, an outstanding note to the land agent in town, a Mr. Thomas Vance, who represented what remained of the old Cordell Company's interests in the valley and who nodded along gravely whenever Silas spoke, as though the two men had rehearsed their sorrow. The cattle were sold to cover the debts. Then the tools. Then, when Eleanor still had not left, Silas informed her that the house itself had been used as collateral and that Vance's company held the deed now, and that she had 30 days. She went to the county clerk and found the papers in order, signed with her husband's name in an unfamiliar hand that she could not prove was forged, only suspect. She went to the minister, who prayed with her but could not unmake a legal document. She went, finally, to Silas himself, and asked him plainly if this was truly what his brother would have wanted, and he told her, without much heat, that Thomas was gone, and what the dead wanted mattered a good deal less than what the living needed, and that she should be grateful he hadn't put her out sooner. She left the Valley farm with a trunk, a Bible, and $11 she had kept hidden in a tin behind the flour barrel. Money Thomas had once called her someday fund, though neither of them had ever said someday for what. She walked the 11 miles into Copper Notch with that trunk balanced on a borrowed handcart, and it was there outside the depot that no longer served any regular train that she saw the notice pinned to the wall. The old railroad company was liquidating and used property along the abandoned spur, including a derelict signal tower on the bluff, sold as is, no warranty, minimum bid. The clerk handling the sale, a dry, kind-eyed man named Otis Pruitt, who had once worked the telegraph key in that very tower, told her plainly that nobody wanted it. The stairs were rotted, the glass was broken, the whole structure leaned a little more each winter, but that the acre of land beneath it had a good well and a view clear down the valley, and that if she truly meant to bid, $8 would likely secure it, since she'd be the only bidder fool enough to want it. She paid the $8 in coin, folded the receipt in her Bible beside her husband's name, and stood looking up at the tower's crooked silhouette against the darkening sky, aware that half the town considered this the final proof that grief had cost Eleanor Bracken her good sense. She did not entirely disagree with them, but her father's voice was in her ever since she was young, telling her that nothing discarded was necessarily ruined, only unexamined. And so that first night, with a borrowed lantern and a great deal of stubbornness, she climbed the leaning stairs to see what, if anything, remained of the tower's insides. Most of it was as expected: dust, mouse nests, a broken stool, the bones of an old lever frame rusted into stillness. But wedged in the corner, bolted to the floor beneath a fallen shelf, sat a heavy iron gearbox, the kind once used to house the signal's turning mechanism, its casing streaked orange with rust and sealed shut with a corroded latch that had not been opened, by the look of it, in a very long time. It took her the better part of a week, working in the evenings with a file and oil and more patience than she knew she had, to coax that latch open, and when it finally gave, the hinges shrieking like something waking from a long sleep, she found inside not gears at all, but a tin dispatch box, dry as bone, tucked in among the mechanism, as though someone had built the box's hiding place on purpose rather than by accident. Inside the tin box, she found a leather-bound ledger, its pages brittle but legible, and beneath it a folded survey map, and beneath that a bundle of letters tied with wax cord, each addressed in a careful hand to a Miss Sarah Whitcomb, a daughter, it seemed, who had apparently never received them, since every one remained sealed. The ledger's first page bore a name Eleanor already knew from the town's soft, vague memory: Abel Whitcomb, signalman, Copper Notch Station, and a date some 22 years past. She read late into the night by lantern light. And what she found in those pages was not the record of trains and signals she expected, but something far stranger, a careful, obsessive accounting, in Whitcomb's own hand, of survey markers moved, of homestead claims quietly redrawn, of parcels that homesteading families believed they owned outright, but which the Cordell Rail and Land Company had, through some patient and deliberate falsification, folded into its own holdings, charging the very families who had cleared and planted that land a yearly improvement lease they believed was simply tax. Whitcomb had apparently discovered the scheme by accident, cross-referencing telegraph traffic with the company's land office in Denver, and had spent years quietly gathering proof. Copies of original survey stakes, correspondence between company officers, even a signed admission from a surveyor who'd been paid to misfile his own honest measurements. And then, according to the ledger's final entries, Whitcomb had grown afraid. He wrote of being followed. He wrote of a fire that had conveniently destroyed the land office's original files just weeks before he meant to bring his evidence to the territorial governor. He wrote, in his last entry, that he intended to seal his findings somewhere no one would think to look and to send word to his daughter to fetch them if anything happened to him. And then the ledger simply stopped mid-sentence, as though the pen had been set down and never picked back up. Eleanor sat with that unfinished sentence for a long time, the lantern guttering, and understood with a cold certainty that she was not merely holding a curiosity. She was holding a dead man's unfinished errand. She spent the following weeks doing what her father had once done with a broken barrel, turning the thing over patiently in her hands until its shape made sense. She found old Otis Pruitt again, the clerk who had once worked the telegraph beside Whitcomb, and though he was a cautious man, unwilling at first to say much, the ledger loosened his tongue considerably, and he confirmed what Whitcomb had written, that the signalman had vanished one autumn without explanation, that the company had said he'd simply moved on, that his daughter had come looking for him once and left disappointed and never returned, and that Otis himself had always privately believed something darker had happened, though he'd had no proof and no standing to say so aloud. Together, working evenings at Eleanor's kitchen table in the crooked little house beneath the tower, they matched Whitcomb's survey map against the county's current plats, and the pattern became undeniable. Dozens of Valley families, including, Eleanor realized with a jolt that stopped her breath, her own late husband's family, had been paying yearly leases on land. The original 1867 homestead filings proved they already owned free and clear. The Cordell Company and its present agent, the same Thomas Vance who had so gravely nodded along while Silas Bracken dismantled her life, had been quietly profiting off a valley that did not know it had already paid for its own ground twice over. She understood then why Silas had been so eager to please Vance, so quick to hand over the farm rather than fight for it. There was buried in one of Whitcomb's later ledger entries a note about a private arrangement with a local family already indebted to the company, a family whose name, when she found it, made her hand go cold and still. Bracken. Her husband's own father, it seemed, had once borrowed against a false lease decades before, and Silas, perhaps not even entirely knowing why, had spent years currying Vance's favor to keep that old debt quiet, a debt that would have evaporated entirely had Whitcomb's evidence ever reached daylight. The Valley's greatest secret, it turned out, was not treasure in the way the word usually promised. It was the truth about who the Valley had always belonged to. Thomas Vance did not take kindly to the questions Eleanor began asking around Copper Notch that autumn. He came to her tower himself one gray afternoon, his boots polished, his manner smooth as a river stone, and suggested, in a reasonable tone of a man accustomed to being believed, that she might be happier selling the old tower and its acre back to the company for a fair price, enough to start fresh somewhere less isolated, somewhere a widow alone might be more comfortable. When Eleanor declined, his tone did not sharpen so much as cool, the way a room cools when a door is left open to winter. Word spread quickly after that. Word that the widow Bracken was making wild claims about old company business. Word that grief had unsettled her judgment. Word, courtesy of Silas himself, that she had always been given to fancies and ought not be indulged. Some in town believed her outright, particularly those old enough to remember Whitcomb and his quiet decency. Others, more cautious, worried what it might mean for a valley to discover its land dealings had rested on rot for 2 decades. Worried about lawsuits, about upheaval, about whether truth was worth the trouble it promised to cause. Eleanor found herself, in those weeks, standing rather alone at the center of a fight she had not asked for, holding a dead man's ledger and a valley's uncertainty in the same trembling hands. Someone broke into the tower one night and rifled through her things, though whether out of Vance's design or simple opportunism, she never learned for certain. And after that, she began sleeping with the ledger and the letters wrapped in oilcloth and buried beneath a loose floorboard, copying key pages out by hand each evening as insurance against loss. Silas came to see her too, not to apologize, but to warn her, in his brother's old kitchen that was no longer his to warn her from, that stirring up the past would not bring Thomas back and would only make enemies of people who could still make her life harder than it already was. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment and told him, quietly, that she had already lost everything a person could threaten to take from her, and that this, oddly, had made her very difficult to frighten. She began, with Otis's help, quietly gathering statement from other Valley families who suspected they too had been paying leases on land already theirs, and though many were afraid to speak openly against the company, a few, an elderly rancher named Garrett Voss, a young widow named Mercy Alden, a Mexican family, the Riveras, who had held their homestead claim since before the Cordell line was even laid, agreed, in hushed voices, to add their names to what Eleanor was assembling, understanding that a single witness could be dismissed, but that many voices together were harder to silence. The territorial circuit judge came through Copper Notch twice a year, holding court in the back room of the Mercantile, and Eleanor timed her preparations to his autumn visit with the same careful patience her father had once used steaming a warped stave back into true shape. She did not go to him with accusations alone, which she knew Vance's lawyers could tangle and doubt for years, but with the whole quiet architecture Whitcomb had built and she had finished, the original 1867 survey markers, the falsified company plats laid side by side against them, the surveyor's own signed admission, and now the sworn statements of families still living on the very land in question. Vance arrived at the hearing with his own attorney and a confidence that curdled visibly as the judge, a stern, unhurried man named Judge Halloway, worked methodically through the ledger page by page, cross-referencing dates against the company's own filed records, which Otis had subpoenaed from the county archive. Silas Bracken, seated near the back, grew paler with each page, understanding perhaps before anyone said it aloud that his own family's old debt and his own complicity in Eleanor's eviction was about to be laid bare before the very community he'd spent years trying to impress. When the judge finally set the ledger down, he did not rule quickly, as this was, after all, no small matter, but he ordered an immediate injunction against further lease collection in the valley pending a full territorial land review, and he ordered the company's own surveyor to appear and answer for the admission bearing his signature. It was, Eleanor would later say, the first time in 2 years she had felt something other than grief or fear settle in her chest, something closer to the quiet satisfaction of watching a warped thing finally pulled straight. The review took the better part of a year, but its outcome, once it came, arrived like a long overdue thaw. The Territorial Land Office, faced with Whitcomb's original evidence and the surveyor's confirmed admission, voided the fraudulent leases across the entire valley, restoring clear title to every family who had unknowingly paid for ground they already owned. The Vosses, the Aldens, the Riveras, and a dozen families besides, including, at last, the Bracken Orchard itself, which the review determined had never rightfully belonged to Vance's company at all. Thomas Vance was quietly removed from his position once the company's Denver office understood the scale of what had been uncovered, unwilling to let one man's schemes sink an entire enterprise's reputation, and he left the valley before the following spring, his smooth manner gone thin and hurried. Silas Bracken faced no prison for his part. The law found nothing criminal in his using his brother's death to seize an estate through cold legal maneuvering, however unkind, but the Valley's memory proved a harder court than any judge's bench. Families who had once tipped their hats to him now crossed the street to avoid the conversation, and the reputation he had spent years cultivating through Vance's favor collapsed the moment Vance himself was gone. He came to Eleanor once more, not long after, standing awkwardly at the base of her tower with his hat in his hands, offering something that was not quite an apology, but was, for a man like Silas, as close as he knew how to come. And Eleanor, who had learned patience from broken barrels and gearboxes both, told him only that she hoped he might learn, someday, that a person's worth was not measured by what he could take from someone weaker than himself. She did not forgive him aloud that day, but neither did she carry the encounter with bitterness afterward, understanding that karmic justice, when it came, rarely announced itself with thunder. More often it simply withdrew a man's audience and left him alone with what he'd done. With the Valley's land restored and its trust in her established, Eleanor did not, as some might have expected, sell the tower and move somewhere grander with whatever gratitude the families offered her. She stayed on the bluff above Copper Notch, and with help from Garrett Voss and the Rivera brothers, repaired the leaning stairs and replaced the shattered glass, turning the old signal tower into something new, a small land office and meeting hall where Valley families could keep their own copies of their restored deeds, where children could be taught to read a survey map so that no family would ever again be at the mercy of someone else's word, and where, on the wall beside the door, she hung a simple frame containing Abel Whitcomb's original, unfinished ledger entry, so that anyone who climbed those stairs would understand exactly whose patient, quiet courage had made the Valley's restoration possible. She finally found the courage, too, to open the sealed letters meant for Sarah Whitcomb, and through the postmaster's careful tracing, located the daughter living modestly in Kansas, now a grandmother herself, who wept reading her father's words after 22 years of silence, and who traveled to Copper Notch the following summer to stand at last in the tower where he had spent his final years, understanding finally that he had not abandoned her, but had died protecting something larger than either of them. And so we return, as we promised, to where we began, to a woman standing on a dirt road with $11 and no home, buying an $8 ruin that half a town called foolish. We return to her name, Eleanor Bracken, because names matter in stories like this one, and hers deserves remembering alongside her father's old lesson, the one she carried all the way from a Missouri cooper's workshop into a rusted gearbox on a Colorado bluff. That nothing discarded is necessarily ruined, only unexamined, and that patience, applied honestly, can straighten what long neglect has warped. She had lost her husband, her farm, her cattle, and very nearly her faith in fairness itself. And what she found in return was not treasure in gold or silver, but something the Valley needed even more badly, the plain truth of who it belonged to, and a reminder that the quiet, overlooked, and rusted-over things of this world are so often the very places where the truest value has been sleeping all along, waiting only for someone patient enough to come looking. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us, and with Eleanor Bracken. If her story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs to remember that overlooked things are rarely worthless things. Before you go, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something the world had already written off? Until next time, stay close.